What's up, everyone? Welcome to episode 73 of the Noizze Podcast, brought to you by Noizze.co.uk and sponsored by Stereo Brain Records. I am your host / your boy, Chris Pugh, and I'm joined, as ever, by my very good friend and Mr. Cynical himself, Samuel Lewis. Mate, on this glorious death metal evening, how are you?
Much less cynical than usual, mate, I'll tell you that. Feeling pretty good about the next 30 to 40 minutes that we're going to be talking about today.
Death metal, right? Mate, death metal?
Death
right? Metal? It's great. I love it so much.
That should be the podcast, actually, just that for 30 minutes. Death metal, right? Death metal, right? Death metal, right?
Because, like, mate,
steadily higher.
You know, like, I've only recently, like, this year, and when I say recently this year, I mean, like, in the last 2 or 3 months, started to delve on death metal. And, mate, what a genre, right?
Yeah. How sick is death metal, Chris?
Mate, unreal. Like, I think what did it for me was Violence Unimagined by Cannibal Corpse, you know.
Oh, right, okay.
Hearing how great that album was this far into their career. And I'd known of Cannibal Corpse quite well. But I was like, wow, this is, like, really, really great. Like, I love this album so much. And they're 20, 30 years into their career. And they're, after 1992, they've pretty much been, like, this kind of harsh death metal band. Obviously, pre-90, when Chris Barnes was in the band, it was, like, insane death metal. The kind of which, I think even me and you, like, mate, Tomb of the Mutilated, it's all a bit silly, isn't it, Tomb of the Mutilated?
Well, it proves the point that the members of Cannibal Corpse were like, should we lighten this up a little?
Yeah.
It's all like, this is getting a bit silly. Yeah, I agree.
But, like, and after that, they're kind of morphed into this, like, really kind of classic, like, fervent death metal band. And we listened to and we loved Violence Unimagined, and I then thought, right, I'm going to, like, go back and listen to, like, the classics of like the death metal genre, and mate, I've found so much good stuff in there. Like, I'd never really listened to Altar of Madness by Morbid Angel before. Mate, it's amazing. So good.
It's class. Yeah, it's really, really good. It's a landmark album for a reason.
And it's really timeless, isn't it, death metal? Like, Altar of Madness, like, early 90s, the exact year has escaped me. I want to say 93. But, like, early 90s at the very least. And, like, mate, it's timeless. That album still bangs hard now.
Yeah, same with Death.
Oh,
like,
mate,
symbolic would be class in 2035.
Easy.
You know what I mean? It's just an amazing album. Same with Slaughter of the Soul by Out the Gates.
Funny you should mention that, Sam. As you can see from the title of this episode, this is our review of the new At the Gates album, The Nightmare of Being. We are the Noizze Podcast, though. We come to you usually every fortnight on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast / watch, we will be there. However, for this occasion, whenever there's a big record coming out that me and Sam would like to discuss, or I've got a big interview that I'm doing, we do release a weekly episode, and this is one of them. So we are going to speak purely about the new At the Gates record, The Nightmare of Being. It is out on July 2nd via Century Media Records. It is the band's 7th studio album and the follow-up to 2018's To Drink From the Night Itself. Sam, you were the first person that ever... Oh, actually, before I get into the review, follow us on Twitter, at Noizze Podcast. Me and Sam both run that account. And the best way to support us is to subscribe if you watch it on YouTube, or like / follow, depending on whichever service you are using. Sam, you were the first person that ever introduced me to At the Gates. If you remember correctly, me and you were walking around HMV in Birmingham. We said to each other, you know what, let's do something cool. You pick a record out of this collection that you want me to hear, and we'll do it vice versa, one that we've never heard before. I picked The Black is Beautiful by Let Live for you. What a ridiculous album. And you picked Slaughter of the Soul for me. So I listened to Slaughter of the Soul. I thought I could tell immediately that it was like this classic landmark, really great record. But it was one of those where I listened to it, that's a great record, and never listened to it again. Until, as I was mentioning right at the introduction of the podcast, after I listened to Violence Unimagined by Cannibal Corpse, I thought, death metal's amazing, and I'm going to go back through death metal and listen to the real classics. And mate, for the last, like, month, I've listened to Slaughter of the Soul, and that album is absolutely daft. It's so brilliant. It's so brilliant.
It's perfect.
And Sam, I think it's a record that you wouldn't understand the importance of Slaughter of the Soul in 1996. You can only really understand the importance of that album now because of the new wave of American heavy metal. I mean, if we look at Killswitch, Unearthed, Shadows Fall, those are three bands off the top of my head that I question what their sound would have been like had Slaughter of the Soul never come out. Because the first real existence of metalcore was Poison the Well and Converge and Botch, and that was a mixture of metal and hardcore. What metalcore became in the mid 2000s, I really am confident that Slaughter of the Soul played a large part of that for not every, but a fair proportion of the bands.
Yeah, can I add In Flames in there as well, who wouldn't exist without At the Gates at all. That Gothenburg death metal sound just laid a landmark. But also we've got bands that, because what the great thing about metal is you get the original band and then you get the bands that follow up from the original band. And then the bands that branch out further. And then we get this whole tree of great music. Like, do we have Opeth? Like, to the level that they are without At the Gates? Probably we still do, but in the same sort of fashion. Do you know what I mean? Do we have black metal in the same sort of way? At least that modern combination of metalcore and death metal and black metal, that sort of melding. Because At the Gates, and we'll get to it later, do a wonderful job of bringing all of these different elements together. Now, Slaughter of the Soul is obviously for my money the perfect death metal album. And it's one of the few really, really flawless metal albums that have ever been created, in my opinion. But it's also patterned different genres outside of just straight death metal. And I think that's something that the Gates do particularly well. And something that as their career has developed, they've actually got a wider repertoire and a bigger palette of stuff as it's gone along. And that's a credit to them. I don't get the impression that they've tried to rewrite Slaughter of the Soul since. I think that every album since has an element of growth. And I think this, Nightmare of Being, is actually a representation of that as well. But obviously we'll talk about that in more detail.
I do want to point out, as we get into the recording here, my microphone stopped working literally 10 seconds before we started recording. So I'm just using the microphone that's built into my laptop here. So if the sound quality isn't great on my end, I apologize for that. And I will absolutely have a new microphone by the time we record the next podcast. But literally like 10 seconds before we started recording, it just died and I've got no idea what's wrong with it. So if the audio is not great from my end, for any listeners, I do apologize for that. Sam, as we move on a little bit here, I would actually also like to preface this with, and people will probably already guess this considering what I was just saying in terms of I've only really recently been going back through death metal and have only recently been really smashing Slaughter of the Soul. I haven't really got great contextual knowledge for At the Gate outside of Slaughter of the Soul. So for me, in terms of knowledge of At the Gate, it's Slaughter of the Soul and then this. So their comeback album in 2014, At War with Reality, not listened to it. Their album that followed that album that followed up that in 2018, To Drink from the Night Itself, I've not listened to it. From how much I like At the Gates now, I am really, really annoyed at myself that I didn't force someone to come and watch them with me at Download when they clashed with Def Leppard. Because the people that I was with wanted to watch Def Leppard, and I didn't know At the Gates really that well. I just knew Slaughter of the Soul banged. So
I feel really bad that I didn't come with you now.
I had to see.
Because you were like, come to Download with me. I was like, And now hearing this story, I would have been fucking fuming at the idea of watching Def Leppard At the Gate. I would have refused to blow it. It just wouldn't have happened.
So I missed At the Gates headline the 4th stage at Download, and I was watching Def Leppard on the main stage. Awful, terrible. So
Chris,
I think that really, Sam, from the death metal that I've been like blasting over the last few months, for the list that I would build, Symbolic by Death is a shoe-in at number 1 for me.
Yeah, I agree.
And then really, Sam, outside of the other classic death metal albums that I've heard, Human, Cause of Death by Obituary, Heartwork by Carcass, Altar of Madness by Morbid Angel, and Slaughter of the Soul can really fill out that list in any order you fancy, really. I mean, if someone insists that Heartwork is second, I wouldn't disagree. For me, as long as Symbolic's number one, whichever other way you want to go about it, that's fine. But I think that obviously we're in that real hot spot in the early 90s, right? Of just these amazing death metal records that were coming out, and at the gates, it's important to mention that like at the gates they released Slaughter of the Soul, and then they just went away. They just went on hiatus. They came back for some rerun shows in 2008, I believe. But really, Slaughter of the Soul, they didn't do another record for 19 years until War with Reality came out. So really, there was like a large gap in the band's discography. And now, Sam, as we get to The Nightmare of Being, I think one of the things I love about this record is that it's a really interesting death metal album. And as much as we love Violence Unimagined, could we say Violence Unimagined is interesting? I don't think we could. It's great. It's a great death metal record, but it's not really interesting, is it?
I understand that. I think what you're very politely saying is that this is a much more intelligent record. Do you feel that way? Without me getting you to say that, do you feel that way?
Yes, so I suppose actually that's what I am saying, and that's not to say that Cannibal Corpse are unintelligent. Good God!
No, of course.
Imagine Corpse Grinder finding out I called him unintelligent. It's just the scariest moment of my life. But what I mean is, this record, similar to Slaughter of the Soul, actually, there's like legitimate moments of like progressive metal in this record, and that
completely agree.
That is difficult to do in the realms of melodic death metal. Making that work is a challenge, but there's loads of it here, and it's really, really intelligently crafted.
I completely agree. I have massive respect for a band that can set the blueprint of one genre and then completely go off from that blueprint that they themselves helped fashion. I think that's an incredible thing to do, and I agree with you. To fill in your gaps, At War with Reality and To Drink from the Night itself are more straight death metal records than this is.
Right, okay.
This is a deliberate move away, not far away, but this is definitely more progressive. Also, there's a song on the album War with Reality that I'm going to have to sit down and show you like in the next 3 or 4 days. Don't worry about it. It's just going to happen. But it's really follows the same fast pace, that sort of Slayer type drum beat is a pattern throughout at Gates' discography with those, those fast paced, high arcing riffs. They're all there. But this does that, but also, like you say, it steps away, and there's a real intricacy to the songwriting structure here. There's a real depth. There's a real complexity. I don't feel that these songs have been written so much as they've been sculpted, that they've been like architecturally pieced together. Because I've been listening to this album, so I love this band. I've been listening to this album pretty much non-stop for like a fortnight. And really, like, the things are still clicking together. Like, I was listening to it early this afternoon, and I was like, I didn't even realise they brought that riff back, but they just play it in a different key here. And, there's this note here that they go back to, and there's this little motif that they sort of readdress, and they do these wonderful things where they'll play a riff, and then they'll sort of subtly bring it back in for like 4 or 5 bars further down the song, but in a kind of different way where if you don't catch it, you don't notice. But it's still subconsciously, wherever you are in the song, because of that happening, even while so much stuff is changing and transitioning. I think it's incredibly clever. I feel like this is like taking a degree in death metal. This album, some of the complexities and the transitions. This is like Harvard Business School for metal songwriting, because the way that some of these songs are structured together, some of the transitions. Now, I love angry metal as much as the Next Man, somewhat more than the Next Man, unless the Next Man is you. But one of the main criticisms I would say for death metal and beyond is that it can be quite formulaic to the point where you can say, okay, this is going to happen, then this, and you kind of all automatically know how long a breakdown's going to last, and when it's going to do that thing where it brings it back slower, and when you kind of already can tell when the solo is going to happen, and that sort of stuff. Where I don't feel that way with At the Gates. I didn't listen to this album, and I found myself unable to predict the twists and turns. It was like kind of watching a really great TV show with like twists and little changes at the end where I was like, oh, I didn't expect this to happen, and oh, that's a fantastic little twist here, and then it brings it back to the original motif that I'd forgotten about from the introduction, because we're sort of 5 minutes down this other rabbit hole. I think because of that, this is such a beautifully written album. I haven't even spoken about the songs yet. You can already tell I'm sort of gushing about this, because this fits, as a metal fan for me, this actually combines two of my different types of fandom, in the sense that I think it contains that intensity and brutality of great metal.
It kind of makes sense that you mentioned that this is like a different sounding At the Gates record to one you've heard before, because I believe, if I've done my research correctly, this is actually their first concept album. It's based off the idea that like pessimism links to the idea of horror. And that's off the works of an author called Thomas Ligotti, who the vocalist of At the Gates, Thomas Redant, is a big fan of. And I think you can hear the idea of this being a concept album getting played out quite regularly, can't you, Sam? Because there are literal moments in songs where the track will just break off into something completely outlandish, and some of it is like amazingly put together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the subtle little changes, but also not even the subtle ones. There's the massive, oh, we're in this room now, we're in a completely different song. God and Cyrus is an example of this.
Oh my God, mate, it's amazing. Like, mate, the sax. Mate, when the sax comes in, bit of Rivers of Nile, I was like, mate, lads, class.
Absolutely. And it didn't even remotely feel out of place at all. I loved it. I loved it as an accompaniment. And then as the song changed, it continued to snake alongside the riffs and sort of like, you know, push upwards toward this brilliant crescendo. Absolutely terrific. But there's so many examples of this. Nightmare of Being. There's like a beautiful solo near the end where it just feels completely different to the first little part of it as well. And it's the same. It's the same with one of my favorite songs we'll get to a little bit later, called Touched by the White Hands of Death, which I just think is amazing. And also that happens at the end of Paradox a little bit too. There's so many moments throughout here. Fall Into Time is the big one as well. Sorry, with the orchestral start.
Yeah,
it breaks into that bit where it's just the bass and the drums, and then the guitar solo comes in, and then it goes back to the introductory riff. And that's the moment that I say that feels like Dream Theater.
Yeah,
it just broke away and it went to that sort of bass and drums, that complex drum fill, and then slowly started building back up, and you completely forget what the song sounded like at the beginning.
Yeah,
to the point that when it returns, it's like, oh yeah, that was a class intro riff as well. And like you were saying, it's appropriate that this is based on literature, because it feels like the musical equivalent to a terrific piece of writing. It feels like a dissertation, you know, when it just delves away and then brings you back with a thesis, and so keeps referring to this overall idea and overarching concepts and stuff, and then concludes at the end. I think it's at the time some of the songwriting here is just stunning.
I mean, mate, Spectre of Extinction, the start of this album, opens with an acoustic that bleeds into a crushing heavy riff. I mean, did they write this for us? It's amazing. It's so good.
It's incredible. It's battery for death metal, isn't it, mate? It's amazing.
So good. I mean, that track, it eventually does break into a classic At the Gates kind of style of intricate riffing in front of them kind of sledge drums. And the lead riff comes back in on the chorus as well. And they do that loads throughout this album, but it never like, it always comes like as a surprise at the way it's kind of structured. Spectre of Extinction is such a great start to this record. It is absolutely brutal, man. I love it so much.
I completely agree. I love the fury, the way that it just gets away from it and then goes right back into that sort of fantastic triplet drum fill. And just keeps so much going on. The crushing rhythms, the high-pitched drilled notes. There's an absolutely face-melting solo in his opening track. It's just unbelievable. And then there's so much life and energy. Like, this is a band, 20 years down the line, they're just absolutely superb. And then the Paradox, Chris. The Paradox does exactly the same. That I don't even know what to call it. Is it like a gong sound, or like this like weird noise they've got at the start that's just this triplet riff, and then it comes right back in with the same sort of stuff. And this is the thing about At the Gates, is that they managed to bridge the crushingly heavy and the beautiful melodic at the same time, how do they write riffs where it's like heavy and grimacing, but at the same time you can hum, you can sing to some of these riffs. It's wonderful. It goes back into this melodic section again that you can hum along to, that you can sing, and there's a beautiful solo at the end. Just the 1-2 punch at this opening record. I was immediately, that's when I was like, you need to listen to this album. Like 2 songs in, I was like, this is class. How are they able to do this? How is there so much vitality in this opening of this record?
Mate, that the big galloping riff that goes through the chorus of the Paradox, it's so good. I absolutely love that, man. I knew, I literally put here that for Garden of Cyrus, I put, I'm absolutely certain, Sam, on my notes, I will love the opening of this. The drum work is gorgeous. And I think Garden of Cyrus is my favourite track, you know. Like,
wow.
The way that the atmosphere is built in the track is like kind of like stunning. There's like a really delicate instrumental in it. There's a saxophone in it, big Rivers of Nile vibes. Love that band. When the vocals do kind of come in, they're pitched quite deep in the mix, but they don't really detract from anything. They're there purely as like an atmospheric tool. This is like a 4-minute exercise in building atmosphere through music. It's so good. Now, like at the Gates, they've had like moments of progression before. This isn't like the first time at the Gates they've ever done anything kind of progressive. I mean, like on Slaughter of the Soul, there's like Under a Serpent's Sun, which like takes like moments of like real progression instrumental. But here, like because of the concept of the album, it's taken to like a whole new realm that I've never heard from At the Gates before. If someone's in the comment section that's like massive on At the Gates and knows their discography, let me know if they've done any other album that leans on this. But I've never heard At the Gates do this before, like to this extent anyway.
No, not to this extent. I completely agree. There are moments, but this is the first time I think that they've had like a focused energy towards extending the style and structure of their songs in this way. I want to talk about my favourite song on the album at this point. You talked about Garden of Cyrus. I want to talk about Touched by the White Hands of Death, which I think immediately is like one of their best songs I've heard. No, I haven't heard every song I've ever written. I just immediately fell in love with this one because it's just got a wonderful intro. Black metal again, like sort of orchestral, descends into this incredible fast-paced riff. Just that you can automatically nod it along to. An incredible chorus riff with an amazing chord sequence. Where the riff sort of continues, but the chords underneath change, and I just think that's wonderful. The way they're able to combine to sort of subtly change mood and tone of a song in not an obvious way, where the main riff continues, but the chords around it change, or there's a slight lead pattern that sort of differentiates it a little bit later. I just think he's so smart. It combines that ingenuity and simplicity that I think At the Gates are just absolutely wonderful at. And then there's like a middle section riff that is just brilliant, but it also feels like a completely different song, a completely different death metal song, but it's equally brilliant. I think the White Hands of Death is so good. You could split that into 2-minute tunes. I think they'd both be really good as standalone. I think it's that good. I really, really do. I think it's terrific. And then obviously, I don't know if you agree, but obviously Garden of Cyrus is caught up on his own with that saxophone and that style. But I think it gets more proggy the further down the album it goes.
Yeah.
And I enjoy that. So every song seems to take one step further, because you get after that you get Fall Into Time with that like Egyptian style
Mate,
riff.
I love the Fall Into Time.
Yeah, with like this strange vocal in the background again, right, where it's like a kind of chorus of voices at the start. Again, I was thinking, right, this is pretty proggy, and then that beautiful build up, and then the aforementioned bass stylings. They seemed on that song, Fall Into Time, they were like, we're just gonna do what we want for 5.5 minutes. It just seems less a song and more like a, I don't know, like a sort of jam session of like expert musicians.
Mate, I tell you how much I was enjoying like the progressive elements of this record. When I saw the Fall Into Time was like 7 minutes, I'm rubbing my hands together, and I'm like, great. There's got a 7-minute track. So if they've already put these elements of progression into like Garden of Cyrus, what are they going to do in 7 minutes? And Fall Into Time absolutely delivers. Like because of the way At the Gates can craft and play with their progressions, you really look at this as like a 7-minute opus. That really grand, ominous opening with the strings behind Thomas is huge. The bass notes on the instrumental we were talking about before, mixed with the drums, how it's pieced together is like an absolute mind blow. And like then the lead guitar comes back in, and it's like kind of technically progressive, and it's all executed so well. It's like the Fall Into Time. I probably would go Garden of Cyrus and then the Fall Into Time in terms of my two favourite songs on this record.
Whoa.
And that's like, and they're the two that I think are probably, for me, from what I can piece together, the most progressive in a melodic death metal album. I think that's why I like the record so much. It's a melodic death metal record, and the two tracks I like the most are the ones that kind of give me that, but then break away over here and do something completely off kilter. That's not to say though that the moments where on this record where At the Gates are just being At the Gates are a letdown, because Sam, the Abstract Enthroned is so direct death metal. It is class. Like within like a second, it turns into this really furious cutting grind mix, and then, but as well as that, there's like church organs thrown into the mix as well. And the guitarist Jonas Stahlhammer, he has put the lead guitarist. He has put a shift in on this record.
P.S. That's the greatest death metal Swedish guitarist name I've ever heard. Stahlhammer is amazing.
Yeah.
He could either be in At the Gates or it could be a dwarf in Lord of the Rings. There was no other profession available for him. That is just amazing.
I wanted to quickly ask you thoughts on lead guitar, because Slaughter of the Soul, obviously their lead guitarist at that point was Anders Bjorla, and he left in 2017. So my in terms of lead guitarist for At the Gate, I only knew Anders Bjorla, but he left in 2017. I think the guitar work on Slaughter of the Soul for me is the best thing about it, and Slaughter of the Soul is crunchier than this record, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. They seem to insert elements of that, but not in the same consistency as Slaughter of the Soul. But I think, to be honest, as they've aged, they've kind of aged like a fine wine in the sense that it's not as aggressive or as punchy or punky, I guess, if for want of a better phrase, as it had been in the early 90s heyday, which is typical for bands. But what they've reached instead is a more thoughtful, perceptive type of approach. You know, I think I really like the transition that they've seemed to have delved into this more thoughtful version of themselves. There's more intricacy, you know, less Patrick Vieira, more Zinedine Zidane type of thing, where there's more technical and more like sort of ethereal as part of their approach. You know what I mean? And that's that when you get those moments like Abstract Enthroned, it felt like a classic At the Gates song, but it was nice within this wider tapestry of At the Gates experimenting that they dropped that in there, because following that it was Cosmic Pessimism, and I've never heard an At the Gates song that remotely sounds like Cosmic Pessimism.
Yeah,
at all.
The conceptual nature of the album jumps out more on Cosmic Pessimism than anywhere else, I feel like, because of the narration and the melodious tone on it.
There's like an element of Tool to that, with at least with the guitar sound and the style of that song. But the more I listened to it, the more I enjoyed it, because as a layered piece of songwriting, it felt like, again, like a television show where the characters just keep building and the narrative just keeps shifting, because it goes backwards and forwards without a real chorus until like sort of the second go around. And I enjoy that they build up to something, then take you away, and then build you up to something, then take you away. And then finally, when it all happens at the conclusion, it feels much more satisfying from a listener. I really enjoyed that, but that takes a lot of courage to write songs in that way without the immediate gratification of a great chorus. Many bands just avoid writing songs that way, like it needs to have a chorus that early, but it absolutely doesn't when it's written like this. And the way that it comes back in, and this massive chorus with these continued lead motifs, I just think is so clever. It's like a meticulously blueprinted song. And then you've got the final track, which it feels like a compilation of almost everything at once, because there are moments here that have sublime melodies throughout Eternal Winter of Reason from the guitarist, with again, head bobbing riffs with like a jungle style. I don't know how else to, because there's like toms going on. There's like a sort of George of the Jungle type feel to it. It's really odd, but it really works within the greater ideas of what they're trying to put together. And it's just a reminder that if without what they're trying to do, without trying to contextualize it, Chris, there are so many great riffs on this album.
Yeah, man.
There are so very many that it feels like there's a couple every song. They're just great chugging riffs. Where I've listened to a lot of albums where it's like one great riff every couple of songs, and you sort of cling on to it like a lifeboat. But this, it's just there's a plethora of stuff to sort of cling on to, and again, I think this reaffirms At the Gates as one of the most intelligent and professional songwriters in this field that we've had, because it's death metal, but it's really strange that it seems to lack the, and I mean this as a compliment, but it seems to lack the maniacal, almost teenage violence of death metal's predecessors, and has replaced that with an almost calm precision. So it feels less like Hammer House Horror, where you're just sort of running around and screaming. It feels more like Saw, or like a cold-blooded Ted Bundy type killer. Do you know what I mean? Where there's a plan and it's meticulously followed. It's not like a raging Tasmanian devil, like that Cannibal Corpse record is, which again, terrific. But that's fury in a bottle. That is, and that's boiled away. And you open it, this is measured and more
this
intelligent.
This is death metal Inception, isn't it?
Yeah,
like death metal Quentin Tarantino. Not the Quentin Tarantino did Inception,
if Quentin Tarantino was a death metal guitarist, he would have written this album. And that's what it feels like, yeah.
I mean, because I came straight in from Slaughter of the Soul to this, I do kind of miss the crunch because I've come directly from 95 to now, like 26 years later. Now, obviously, and that's not a criticism now, because like I said, this is 26 years on from Slaughter of the Soul. It would be massively unfair if I use that as criticism. I'm just saying, objectively, I do miss that real nasty biting crunch. However, I love the progressive elements that this record brings that Slaughter of the Soul didn't.
That's interesting. I think that's fair. Do you think a lot of that rawness and crunch is made up by the mixing job that was less polished in the mid-90s? And usually we're pro, polished mixes, aren't we? Usually, so maybe there's an element where you have to toe the line between that a little bit, because the Cannibal Corpse record, to refer to it again, lots of rawness, lots of crunch, but also the mixing job was very hands off. It felt like just play, we'll press play, stop, and record. That's all we're doing. Whereas this feels very much pieced together in an And Justice for All type meticulous kind of way, and I think that's for its benefit. I think, Chris, I'll be honest, I think because if you listen to their previous albums, it's not mixed as well as these, even in 2018. To Drink from the Night itself has a rawness, and I feel that as a result of that maybe the album's style and content actually dictated their mixing decisions and production ideas. So maybe if we ever saw a return to Lust, like if 12 songs were abstract enthroned, maybe it would have that rawness, because they would let the mixing job reflect that songwriting style.
You were kind of talking about this earlier in terms of this isn't a Fury in a Bottle record. When I interviewed Max Cavalera for Distorted Sound, he referred to some death metal bands, and he meant this as a compliment, as like caveman metal, in terms of death metal made like purely for the aggressive, just survive nature. And this, just to kind of add a little extra footnote to your point, this is a much more open feathered, like kind of peacock of a death metal record, right? It's melodic death metal with just so much in there that we could probably spend another 30 minutes breaking apart. But the one thing I wanted to add before we close off here, Eternal Winter of Reason has a massive chorus on it. When have you ever said that about a melodic death metal band? It's chorus on Eternal Winter of Reason. The chorus is huge. it's like borderline anthemic within the confines of melodic death metal. Who does that? Who's capable of doing that? It's ridiculous. It's amazing.
It's an incredibly small list, but At the Gates at the top of it.
Mate, the way you've spoken about this record, I'm not going to ask you if it's your album of the year. I'm just saying, from the way you've discussed this, I'm assuming it's right up there, because from the way we spoke about Architects, While She Sleeps, Teenage Wrist, you've spoken as positively, if not more so, about this than any of them. So has this has shot itself straight into the conversation for you?
It's in the conversation, absolutely. Yeah, it's if the list ended tomorrow, it'd be a top 5 album, no doubt.
You'd love to hear it, man. That is going to close off our review of the new At the Gates record, The Nightmare of Being. It is out on the 2nd of July via Century Media Records. Me and Sam are going to be back. This episode is going to come out on Friday the 25th. Me and Sam are going to be back on Tuesday the 6th. On that podcast, we should hopefully have an interview with Born of Osiris guitarist Lee McKinney. And we'll be looking at a new record from Cognitive, and I'll be looking at other things that are coming out then as well. Remember, the best way to support us is to subscribe on the YouTube channel or to follow/like, depending on whichever service you are using. This was our review of The Nightmare of Being by At the Gates. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. We are going to be back on June the 6th. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you soon. We love you. Bye.